The sky had turned that peculiar shade of green that every person living on the Kansas prairie learned to fear. 26-year-old Sarah Bennett stood on the porch of her small homestead cabin, watching the massive funnel cloud form on the western horizon like a finger of God reaching down from the heavens. The wind had already begun to pick up, whipping her skirts around her legs and pulling loose strands of blonde hair from the bun at the nape of her neck. She should have been running for the storm cellar. Every instinct and every lesson learned from a lifetime on the frontier told her to take shelter immediately. But something made her pause, scanning the empty prairie one more time. And that's when she saw him, a man on horseback riding hard across the open grassland, directly in the path of the approaching tornado. The rider was still nearly half a mile away, but Sarah could see that he was struggling. His horse was limping, clearly injured, and the man himself seemed to be having difficulty staying in the saddle. As she watched, the horse stumbled and went down, throwing its rider hard onto the ground. Sarah made a split-second decision that would change her life forever. Instead of seeking shelter, she ran toward the fallen stranger, her boots pounding across the hard-packed earth as the roar of the approaching tornado grew louder behind her. The wind was so strong now that it nearly knocked her over, and debris was already beginning to fly through the air, small sticks and leaves that stung when they hit her face and arms. The man was trying to rise when she reached him, one hand pressed against his ribs, his face contorted with pain. Up close, Sarah could see that he was probably in his early 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and eyes that were clouded with confusion and hurt. "Can you walk?" she shouted over the increasing roar of the wind. "I think my ribs are broken," he gasped. "You need to go. Save yourself." "Not without you," Sarah replied firmly. She ducked under his arm, taking as much of his weight as she could manage, and began half dragging, half carrying him toward her cabin. "My storm cellar is just ahead. We can make it if you help me." The stranger tried to support his own weight, but Sarah could feel him leaning heavily on her as they staggered forward. Behind them, the tornado's roar had become deafening, and Sarah knew with terrible certainty that they weren't going to make it to the cellar in time. The funnel cloud was too close, moving too fast across the open prairie. She changed direction, heading instead for the cabin itself. It was an ideal shelter, but it was closer than the cellar, and they had run out of time. As they stumbled through the door, Sarah could see objects flying through the air outside, pieces of fence, parts of her small barn, things that would kill them if they were caught in the open. "Get down!" she shouted, pulling the stranger toward the interior corner of the cabin, the strongest point of the structure. They huddled together on the floor as the tornado hit with the force of a freight train. The noise was indescribable, a screaming, tearing, grinding roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Sarah felt the stranger's arms close around her protectively, sheltering her body with his own as the cabin began to shake and shudder. Boards creaked and nails shrieked as they were pulled from the wood. The roof lifted slightly, then slammed back down, and Sarah was sure they were going to die in the next few seconds. Then, as suddenly as it had hit, the tornado passed. The terrible roar faded into the distance, leaving behind an eerie quiet, broken only by the sound of settling debris and Sarah's own rapid breathing. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Sarah was acutely aware that she was pressed against the stranger's chest, protected by his arms, close enough to feel his heartbeat and hear his labored breathing. Slowly, carefully, they untangled themselves and sat up, assessing the damage. The cabin had survived, though just barely. The roof was partially torn away, allowing them to see the clearing sky above. One wall had been pushed inward, and all the windows were shattered. But the structure was still standing, and more importantly, they were both alive. "You saved my life," the stranger said, his voice rough with pain and emotion. "You risked your own life to help a complete stranger." Sarah looked at him more carefully now, taking in details she had missed in the rush to reach safety. He was dressed in good quality clothes, not fancy but well-made and expensive. His boots were hand-tooled leather, and his coat, though now covered in dust and debris, had clearly been tailored to fit him. There was something in his bearing, even injured and sitting on the floor of her damaged cabin, that suggested authority and confidence. "Anyone would have done the same," Sarah said. though she knew that wasn't entirely true. Many people would have prioritized their own safety over that of a stranger. "No," the man said firmly. "Not many people would have risked what you just risked." He tried to stand, then gasped and pressed his hand to his ribs again. "I'm James Thornton, and I'm deeply in your debt, Miss Sarah Bennett. Mrs. Bennett, actually, though I'm a widow now." Sarah moved to help him, noting the way he flinched when she touched his side. "Those ribs definitely need looking at. Let me help you to the bed, and then I'll see what I can do." As she helped James to the small bed in the corner of the cabin that hadn't been damaged, Sarah's mind was racing with practical concerns. The tornado had destroyed what little she had. Her barn was completely gone, the chicken coop had been scattered across the prairie, and most of her precious winter supplies had probably blown away. She was already struggling to keep her small homestead running after her husband's death 6 months ago, and this disaster might be the final blow that forced her to give up and return to her family in Missouri in shame and defeat. But those were worries for later. Right now, she had an injured man to tend to, and tending to people in need was something Sarah knew how to do, even when she couldn't solve her own problems. She carefully examined James's ribs through his shirt, noting the way he tensed when she pressed certain areas. "I think you're right about the broken ribs. At least 2, maybe 3. I'll need to bind them tightly, which is going to hurt." "I can take it," James said, though his face was pale with pain as Sarah worked, carefully wrapping his torso with strips of cloth torn from one of her sheets. She found herself curious about this stranger who had literally dropped into her life in the middle of a tornado. "What were you doing out here?" she asked. "No one should have been riding in weather like that." "I was checking on my property," James replied, then grimaced as she pulled the binding tighter. "I have several parcels of land in this area, and I wanted to make sure the tenant families were prepared for the storm. I was heading back to town when my horse stepped in a gopher hole and went lame." "Your property?" Sarah echoed, pausing in her work. "How much property do you have out here?" James met her eyes, and for the first time she saw something that might have been discomfort in his expression. "Quite a bit, actually. My family has been acquiring land in this county for the past 20 years. Sarah finished binding his ribs and stepped back, a suspicion forming in her mind. "Thornton. James Thornton. Are you related to William Thornton, who owns the bank in Cedar Springs?" "He was my father. He passed away last year, and I inherited his holdings." Sarah felt her stomach drop. The Thornton family was legendary in this part of Kansas. Wealthy landowners who controlled most of the county through a combination of banking, ranching, and various business interests. They were the kind of people who lived in mansions in town and traveled to St. Louis and Chicago for entertainment. They were definitely not the kind of people who ended up on the floor of a widow's broken cabin, being tended by someone who could barely afford flour. "I see," Sarah said quietly, suddenly aware of the vast social distance between them. "Well, Mr. Thornton, you're welcome to rest here until you're feeling well enough to make it back to town. I'll see if I can find something for the pain and some food that wasn't destroyed." James caught her wrist gently as she turned away. "Please don't treat me differently now that you know who I am." "You saved my life, Sarah. My family's money and land don't change that." Sarah looked down at his hand on her wrist, noting the strength in his grip despite his injuries. "Your money and land change everything, Mr. Thornton. I'm a struggling widow trying to hold on to 40 acres that your family probably considers pocket change. We come from different worlds." "Maybe," James conceded, releasing her wrist. "But right now we're both tornado survivors in a damaged cabin, and I owe you my life. Can't we start from there?" Sarah wanted to maintain her pride and distance, but something in his eyes, a genuine warmth and sincerity, made her defenses crack slightly. "I suppose we can start from there," she agreed. "But first, let me see what I can salvage for dinner." The investigation of her supplies revealed that she had lost more than she feared, but not quite everything. The tornado had scattered most of her stored goods, but she managed to find some intact jars of preserved vegetables, a sack of flour that had somehow remained in the corner where it was stored, and even a few eggs that had survived the destruction of her chicken coop. As she worked to prepare a simple meal, James watched her from the bed, and Sarah was acutely aware of his presence. There was something magnetic about him, something that went beyond his obvious physical attractiveness or his wealthy family background. He had a way of looking at her that made her feel truly seen, as if he was paying attention not just to what she said, but to who she was beneath the words. "Tell me about your husband," James said as Sarah stirred a pot of vegetable soup over the small fire she had managed to coax to life in the damaged fireplace. "If you don't mind talking about him." Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering how to explain the complicated feelings she had about Thomas Bennett. "We married young. I was 17, he was 19. He had big dreams about homesteading and making our fortune on the frontier. But the reality was harder than either of us expected." She ladled soup into 2 bowls and brought one to James, helping him sit up enough to eat despite the pain in his ribs. Thomas was a good man, but he was more of a dreamer than a farmer. He'd spend hours planning irrigation systems that we couldn't afford to build or breeding programs for livestock we didn't own. When he got sick with pneumonia last winter, I think part of him was almost relieved to let go of the dreams that were never going to come true. "That must have been very difficult for you," James said quietly. It was. But in some ways it was also freeing. Sarah surprised herself with the admission. "I loved Thomas, but I also spent our entire marriage trying to make his dreams come true instead of figuring out what my own dreams were. Now, I'm trying to decide if I should keep fighting to hold on to this land, or if I should admit defeat and go back to Missouri." "What do you want to do?" James asked, and the way he asked, as if her answer actually mattered to him, made Sarah pause and really think about the question. "I want to stay," she admitted. "I want to prove that I can make something of this place, that I'm not just a helpless widow who needs to run home to her family. But I don't know if I can do it alone." They talked late into the night, long after the simple meal was finished. James told her about his own struggles with inheriting his father's empire, about the pressure to maintain the family legacy and the loneliness of being surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Sarah found herself opening up about her own dreams and fears in ways she never had with Thomas, who had always been so focused on his own visions that he rarely asked about hers. When Sarah finally insisted that James get some rest, she made a bed for herself on the floor near the fireplace, giving him the actual bed since he was injured. But she found it hard to sleep, her mind churning with thoughts about the strange turn her life had taken. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the tornado had never happened. Sarah rose early and went outside to assess the full extent of the damage to her property. It was worse than she had hoped, but not quite as bad as she had feared. The barn was completely destroyed, along with most of her fencing. The chicken coop was gone, and she could see several of her chickens dead in the field. But the main structure of the cabin had held, and with some work, it could be made livable again. She was standing amid the wreckage of her barn when she heard horses approaching. 3 men on horseback were riding up to her property, led by a distinguished-looking older man with silver hair and a concerned expression. "Mrs. Bennett?" the older man called out. "I'm Doc Harrison from Cedar Springs. We received word that James Thornton might be in this area when the tornado hit. Have you seen him?" Sarah was about to answer when James himself appeared in the doorway of the cabin, moving slowly and carefully but clearly determined to come outside. "I'm here, Doc," James called out. "Mrs. Bennett saved my life yesterday." What followed was a flurry of activity as Doc Harrison examined James's injuries, while the other men, employees of the Thornton family, Sarah realized, checked on the state of her property and asked detailed questions about what had happened. Through it all, James insisted on giving Sarah full credit for his survival, describing in vivid detail how she had risked her own life to help a stranger and then tended his injuries with skill and compassion. "You're a lucky man," Doc Harrison said as he finished examining James. "Those ribs are badly broken, and if you'd been caught in the open when that tornado hit, you'd likely be dead. Mrs. Bennett, you're a brave woman and a credit to this community." "I just did what anyone would do," Sarah protested, uncomfortable with all the attention. "That's not what anyone would do, and you know it," James said firmly. He turned to the men who had accompanied the doctor. "I want Mrs. Bennett's property completely restored. New barn, new fencing, replacement chickens and livestock. Whatever she lost in the tornado, we replace. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and pride warring in her chest. Mr. Thornton, I appreciate the offer, but I can't accept charity. It's not charity, James replied, his voice gentle but firm. You saved my life, Sarah. The least I can do is help you rebuild what you lost while doing it. He's right, Mrs. Bennett, Doc Harrison added. The Thornton family takes care of the people who take care of them. It's one of the reasons they're so respected in this county, Sarah wanted to argue, but she also knew that refusing help out of pride when she desperately needed it would be foolish. I'll accept your help with the rebuilding, she said carefully, but only if I can work to earn it. I won't be in debt to anyone, even someone whose life I saved. James smiled for the first time since she had met him, and the expression transformed his face completely. I think we can arrange that. I'll need someone to manage some of my properties in this area, someone who understands both farming and the practical challenges of homestead life, someone who's tough enough to survive a tornado and smart enough to know when to accept help. Over the following weeks, as Sarah's property was rebuilt with astonishing speed and efficiency, she found herself seeing James regularly. He came by to check on the progress, always bringing supplies or news about the rebuilding efforts, always finding reasons to linger and talk. They discussed everything from agricultural techniques to philosophy, from local politics to their personal dreams and fears. Sarah discovered that James was nothing like what she had expected from a wealthy landowner. He was thoughtful and generous, yes, but he was also lonely and uncertain about his place in the world. He confessed that most people saw him as a source of money or favors rather than as a person, and that he had begun to wonder if anyone would ever value him for himself rather than for his family name. That's why what you did was so remarkable, he told her one afternoon as they watched workers put the finishing touches on her new barn. You helped me before you knew who I was. You didn't see the Thornton fortune or the family legacy. You just saw someone who needed help. I still just see someone who needs help, Sarah teased gently. Those ribs are going to take at least 2 more months to heal completely, and you keep pushing yourself too hard. James laughed, then winced as the movement hurt his ribs. You're probably right. My mother is furious with me for not resting in town like Doc Harrison recommended, but I find I have a powerful motivation to be out here checking on my properties these days. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as she understood his meaning. Over the past weeks, she had come to care for James in ways that both excited and terrified her. He was everything Thomas hadn't been, ambitious but also practical, wealthy but also down-to-earth, confident but also capable of vulnerability. But the difference in their social positions still troubled her. James, she said carefully, you know we're from different worlds. Even if you wanted something more than friendship between us, your family would never accept a poor widow as a suitable match. My family doesn't dictate my life, James said firmly. And you're not a poor widow. You're a strong, intelligent, capable woman who happens to have had some bad luck. There's a difference. He took her hand, and the touch sent electricity through Sarah's entire body. I care about you, Sarah, not because you saved my life, though I'll always be grateful for that. I care about you because you're the first person in years who's treated me like a regular human being instead of a walking bank account. I care about you too, Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I don't want to be just another obligation for you, another property to manage or problem to solve. You could never be an obligation, James said, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. But if you need time to believe that, I can wait. 3 months later, on a beautiful autumn day when the prairie grass had turned golden and the sky was impossibly blue, Sarah Bennett became Sarah Thornton in a ceremony attended by half the county. She wore a dress that James's mother had insisted on commissioning from St. Louis, but she carried wildflowers from the prairie that she and James had picked together the morning of the wedding as they stood before the minister in the newly rebuilt church, another project James had funded after discovering that the tornado had damaged several community buildings. Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had saved a stranger's life without knowing who he was, and in doing so, she had saved her own life in ways she was only beginning to understand. The wedding reception was held on the grounds of Sarah's homestead. She had insisted on that, wanting to celebrate their union on the land where they had met. Tables groaned with food, musicians played lively tunes, and people danced and laughed as the sun set over the prairie. James pulled Sarah aside during the festivities, leading her to the spot where he had fallen from his horse on that fateful day. "Do you remember what you said to me right here?" he asked, wrapping his arms gently around her waist. "I asked if you could walk," Sarah recalled, smiling at the memory. "And I told you to save yourself. But you refused to leave me behind." James's voice was thick with emotion. "You taught me that day that real strength isn't about having power or money. It's about having the courage to help someone else, even when helping them puts you at risk." "You taught me something too," Sarah said, reaching up to cup his face gently. "You taught me that I don't have to do everything alone, that accepting help isn't weakness, and that sometimes the storms in our lives clear the way for something better than we ever imagined." They kissed as the sun disappeared below the horizon. Two people who had found love in the midst of a tornado and built something stronger than any storm could ever break. Years later, their children would hear the story of how their parents met, how their mother had rescued their father from a tornado without knowing he owned half the county, and how their father had helped their mother discover that she was worth far more than she had ever believed. It became a family legend, the kind of story that got better with each telling, though the truth was remarkable enough on its own. But what their children couldn't fully understand until they were older was the deeper truth beneath the dramatic rescue story, that their parents had saved each other in ways that had nothing to do with tornadoes or money or social position. They had saved each other by seeing past the labels and assumptions to the real people underneath, by having the courage to trust when trust seemed dangerous, and by building a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine love. The Bennett Thornton Ranch became one of the most successful and progressive operations in Kansas, known not just for its prosperity, but for its fair treatment of workers and innovative agricultural practices. Sarah and James worked side by side for decades, building an empire that was about far more than accumulating wealth. It was about creating opportunities for others and proving that success built on genuine partnership was always stronger than success built on power alone. And on those rare occasions, when a tornado warning would sound across the prairie, Sarah and James would gather their children into the storm cellar they had built together, much larger and more secure than the one Sarah had on her original homestead, and they would tell the story one more time about the day a tornado brought them together and changed both their lives forever. If this story of unexpected love found in life's most dangerous moments touched your heart and reminded you that true partnership transcends social barriers and that the best relationships are built on seeing each other's true worth, please share it with someone who believes in the transformative power of compassion. Your support helps us continue creating stories that celebrate the beautiful truth that sometimes our most terrifying moments lead to our greatest blessings. Subscribe for more tales that remind us all that real wealth is measured not in money or land, but in the depth of human connection and the courage to help others even when helping them costs us something. Thank you for being part of our storytelling family.